He wore the nation's uniform with pride, a man who had given decades of his life to service, carrying scars that most will never see. But on an ordinary afternoon, none of that mattered. To two officers, he wasn't a veteran, a leader, or a protector. He was just another black man they decided didn't belong. Handcuffed on the side of the road, his dignity stripped away. His silence wasn't weakness. It was a calm before something much bigger. Because the call he made next didn't just clear his name. It ended careers. But how did a decorated man in uniform end up treated like a criminal at a gas station? The answer lies in what happened moments before the cuffs clicked shut. It was the kind of afternoon that barely stood out. The sun was heavy, the air still, and the rhythm of the day felt ordinary. General Lionel Braxton had done this routine countless times, filling up his car before heading back to his hotel, minding his own business, blending in like anyone else. At 67, he carried himself with the quiet strength of someone who had seen both war zones abroad and boardrooms in Washington. He wasn't in uniform that day, just khakis, a polo, and a pair of worn loafers. Nothing about him screamed authority. Nothing about him suggested the storms he had weathered. But for Lionel, normalcy rarely lasted long. The uniform might have been off, but the weight of who he was never truly disappeared. And that day, it would be ignored entirely. Because in a matter of minutes, the calm of an ordinary stop would collide with a suspicion he couldn't outrun. Not for what he did, but for who he was. He thought this was just another stop on just another road trip. He didn't know it was a first step into a storm that would make headlines across the nation. Lionel Braxton moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent his life navigating situations most people could never imagine. Yet at that gas station, that confidence was tested in ways he never thought possible. As he pulled a nozzle from its holder, he noticed the slow crawl of a patrol car at the edge of the lot. It lingered too long, circled back, then parked. Two officers sat inside, their eyes fixed on him. Not the pumps, not the store, just him. He had seen that look before, not on battlefields, but in towns and streets where suspicion was written into the faces of men who had already judged him before he spoke. The doors opened. One officer, broad and heavy-set, stepped out with the stiff stride of someone determined to show control. The other, younger and lankier, followed a few steps behind, his hand brushing nervously at his belt. They didn't come for gas. They came for him. They asked him to step away from his car, their tone clipped, their posture sharp. He showed his ID, military official undeniable. It should have ended there. But it didn't. The ID wasn't enough. His words weren't enough. To them, his presence was a crime. What happened next felt less like procedure and more like punishment. Their voices grew firmer, their demands heavier. And when he didn't move fast enough, their patience snapped. His body was pressed against the metal of the car, his wrists bound by cuffs that dug into his skin. The sting wasn't just physical. It was the insult, the erasure of everything he had given to the very country these men claimed to protect. And then came the sound neither officer seemed to notice, the faint voice on the phone that had slipped from Braxton's hand onto the pavement. He had answered it moments before the confrontation escalated. It wasn't just any call. It was the Pentagon. His name echoed to the receiver, distant but sharp, carried over the speaker as the scuffle unfolded. "General Braxton, do you copy?" The younger officer froze for half a second, glancing at the phone. He heard it. He knew. But he looked away, pretending it wasn't there. Inside the cruiser, time dragged like an eternity. Braxton sat in silence, his body rigid, his eyes fixed straight ahead. He didn't plead. He didn't argue. He knew silence could speak louder than words, especially when every word could be twisted into something it wasn't. But outside that car, forces were already moving. The Pentagon hadn't hung up. They were listening. They were mobilizing. Within minutes, phone lines lit up across Virginia. State police, military liaisons, even federal oversight. What the officers thought was just another stop was quickly spiraling into a storm far beyond their control. And it wasn't just Washington. A young woman parked at the edge of the lot had lifted her phone the moment she saw two white officers shove an older black man into cuffs. She pressed record. By the time they shoved him into the cruiser, the video was already online. Her caption was simple but devastating. Asterisk, they just cuffed a black man who said he's a general. Asterisk, within hours. It spread, retweeted, shared, debated. News outlets were tagged. Civil rights attorneys were notified. The eyes of thousands began turning toward that small Virginia gas station, long before the officers realized the scope of what they had done. But in that moment, under the weight of handcuffs and suspicion, Lionel Braxton wasn't thinking about trending hashtags or legal battles. He was thinking about the silence that follows humiliation, the silence he had carried before, the silence countless others had endured. Only this time, the silence wasn't the end. It was the beginning, because as the officers scribbled notes on clipboards and shifted nervously in the heat, dark SUVs were already on their way. And when they arrived, nothing about that afternoon would remain routine. He thought the worst was behind him, but the storm that was about to break would shake more than just a small-town sheriff's department. It would rattle the nation. The metal of the cruiser pressed cold against Lionel Braxton's back as the cuffs bit deeper into his wrists. Sweat gathered at his temples. But it wasn't fear that gripped him. It was the crushing weight of humiliation. A man who had once commanded thousands, now treated as less than human. His identity erased in seconds by two men who saw only the color of his skin. Officer Tressler paced outside, scribbling on a clipboard, his jaw tight, his posture defiant. Officer Rayburn lingered near the door, shifting uncomfortably, his eyes betraying doubt. The phone on the pavement still hummed faintly, the Pentagon's voice breaking through the static. But the officers ignored it. To them, the call meant nothing. To Washington, it meant everything. And then it happened. The growl of engines cut through the thick summer air. A black SUV sped into the lot, stopping hard. Two men in dark suits stepped out with the kind of authority that didn't need to be announced. Military liaisons. Federal muscle. The air shifted instantly. "Who's in charge here?" One of them barked, badge flashing. Tressler squared his shoulders, trying to hold his ground. "I am." But his words carried none of the certainty he wanted. The taller agent pointed to the cruiser. "That man you've got in cuffs? That's General Lionel Braxton. 4 stars. Decades of service. You just cross a line you can't step back from." For the first time, the younger officer faltered. His lips parted, but no words came out. He glanced at Braxton through the window, realization spreading across his face like a sickness. The door swung open and the cuffs came off, but the damage had already been done. The red welts on Braxton's wrist told a story no apology could erase. Cameras were rolling. Phones were live. The world was already watching. In that moment, the shift was undeniable. The power dynamic flipped. The men who thought they were in control were suddenly scrambling, their certainty unraveling as fast as the truth spread beyond that parking lot. But Lionel Braxton didn't shout. He didn't rage. He stood tall, shoulders squared, his silence louder than any protest. His very presence was an indictment, a reminder of what had just been stripped away, not his freedom, but his dignity, in plain sight. And while the officers struggled to explain themselves, somewhere far beyond that gas station, calls were being made to the governor, to the Pentagon, to the press. The storm had arrived, and there was no shelter for those who started it, because this was no longer about a routine stop. It was about the nation seeing, once again, how quickly respect could vanish when a black man's uniform wasn't visible. What happened next wouldn't just change 2 careers. It would ignite a fire that no department press release could put out. But if the cuffs coming off marked the turning point, the real reckoning was still to come. The cuffs were gone, but the sting of them lingered. Lionel Braxton stood in the parking lot, wrists red and raw. The heat of the metal still etched into his skin. The agents who came to his side moved quickly, ushering him away from the officers who had just treated a decorated general like a threat. But Lionel didn't rush. He carried himself with the same composure he had learned on battlefields, a composure that spoke louder than any outburst could. The officers who cuffed him avoided his gaze. They knew what was coming. In their world, it had been a stop gone too far. In his world, it was a wound carved from the same blade that had cut countless others before him. The kind of wound that doesn't bleed but burns, because it tells you, no matter who you are, no matter what you've given, you are still just a suspicion, Still just a target. Still just black. By nightfall, the story had spread far beyond that gas station. The video filmed by a bystander had reached millions. News anchors spoke his name. Hashtags trended. And in offices of power, military, political, and legal, the phone lines were on fire. Investigations were launched. Press conferences were called. Careers began to unravel. But for Lionel Braxton, the impact wasn't about headlines or politics. It was about the look in the eyes of those officers. The look that said his history, his sacrifice, his rank. None of it mattered in that moment. That realization wasn't new, but it cut deep all the same. And that is the truth many refuse to see. That racism doesn't pause for medals. It doesn't step aside for uniforms. It doesn't vanish because someone earned respect. It lingers, waiting for the right moment to remind you that in the eyes of some, you will never be more than a threat. The country reacted with outrage, but outrage has come before. Outrage has burned bright, then dimmed, leaving the system unchanged. The real question isn't how shocked we are when these moments surface. It's why they keep happening. Why does a man have to prove, again and again, that he deserves the humanity he should have been granted from the start? Lionel Braxton didn't speak that night. He didn't need to. His silence became a symbol, a reminder that even the highest honors cannot shield someone from the shadow of prejudice. A reminder that the fight for dignity isn't one with medals. It's one when no one has to fear being handcuffed for existing. He had survived war zones. He had navigated politics. But it was here at a simple gas station that his greatest battle was laid bare. The battle against being unseen, unheard, disbelieved. So what does this story demand of us? It demands that we stop looking away, that we stop treating each injustice as an exception rather than a pattern, that we ask, not if it will happen again, but how we will respond when it does. Because if a man who gave everything to his country can still be stripped of his dignity in seconds, what does that say for everyone else with no uniform, no rank, no voice to carry their story into the halls of power? This wasn't just about Lionel Braxton. It was about the weight carried by millions. And the question remains, how many more risks must bear the march of injustice before we finally decide that enough is enough?